Here is something most people get completely wrong about how empires end. They assume it happens with a crash, a battle, a surrender ceremony, a flag lowered in front of cameras with the world watching. They assume you can point to the exact day on a calendar and say, that was the moment. That was when everything changed. History rarely works that way. Most of the time, an empire does not collapse. It renegotiates quietly, in hotel rooms and back channels and documents whose language is chosen with surgical precision to obscure exactly what is being conceded and to whom. In the spring of 2025, 3 things happened within roughly the same 72-hour window that most people processed as separate stories about separate places. A peace framework was initialed in a European palace, carrying language that no American administration had ever used toward Iran in 46 years of hostility. 4 Israeli soldiers died on a ridge in southern Lebanon, and the political earthquake inside Tel Aviv that followed had almost nothing to do with the ridge itself. And somewhere over the outskirts of Moscow, the largest drone swarm ever directed at a Russian city darkened the sky above an oil refinery 15 kilometers from the Kremlin Wall. 3 stories, 3 theaters, 3 sets of cameras pointing in 3 different directions. But pull back far enough, and what you're actually looking at is a single story. And the story is about what happens when the world's most powerful nation runs out of the one currency that actually keeps the whole system running. Not money, not weapons, not soldiers, credibility. To understand why any of this is significant, you have to go back roughly 30 years and understand the operating assumption that ran through every major foreign policy decision the United States made in the Middle East from about 1991 onward. The assumption was elegant in its simplicity. American power was categorically different from all previous forms of great power dominance. It was not merely military, though the military component was dominant enough to render the comparison almost absurd. The United States in 1991 spent more on defense than the next 14 countries combined. It was not merely economic, though the dollar's role as the global reserve currency gave Washington a financial lever that no previous hegemon had ever possessed. The deeper assumption was structural. The argument, made explicitly by thinkers like Charles Krauthammer and Francis Fukuyama, and implicitly by every national security document produced in the 1990s, was that American primacy was self-reinforcing. Countries that tried to resist it paid an escalating cost. Countries that accommodated it received predictable benefits. And over time, the gap between those 2 outcomes would make resistance irrational for any rational actor. Iran, in this framework, was the clearest test case. It had been designated a state sponsor of terrorism since 1984. It had seen its currency devalued by sanctions to the point where a dollar purchased roughly 300,000 rials by 2020, compared to roughly 70 rials in 1979. Its oil exports, which once placed it among the top 5 global producers, had been squeezed to a fraction of that capacity. Its banking system was effectively severed from the international payment infrastructure that runs the global economy. And yet, Iran was still there, still enriching uranium, still projecting influence through proxy networks that reached from Beirut to Baghdad to Sana'a, still conducting naval exercises in the Strait of Hormuz. Still, this is the fact that the operating assumption could never quite metabolize. The cost of defiance was real. The damage was measurable, but the defiance itself had not been broken. And something about that gap between the punishment and the result should have raised a much harder question much earlier than it eventually did. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest navigable point. 21 miles. You could drive that distance in a mid-size American city going from one suburb to another without noticing you had crossed anything significant. But through those 21 miles passes, on average, 21 million barrels of oil every single day. That is approximately 21% of all the petroleum traded globally. It is the corridor through which the energy supply of Japan, South Korea, China, and India runs. It is the artery that keeps the lights on in economies representing roughly 40% of global GDP. When Iranian naval forces and allied coastal artillery effectively closed that corridor in the opening weeks of the conflict that began in late 2024, the price of Brent crude moved from approximately $78 a barrel to $143 in 11 trading days. That is not a record. It is worse than a record. It is the kind of price movement that triggers automatic political crises in every import-dependent economy on Earth simultaneously. American strategic petroleum reserves, which are maintained precisely for moments like this, were drawn down to their lowest usable level since the reserve was established in 1975. Several analyses published after the fact suggest that at the rate of drawdown during the first 6 weeks of the conflict, the reserve would have been functionally depleted within 4 to 5 months, not empty, but below the threshold at which it provides meaningful price stabilization rather than just political optics. A president whose entire domestic political identity rested on energy affordability, And a rising stock market was watching both collapse simultaneously in real time on a ticker he could not control because of a war his own administration had initiated or, at minimum, had enabled. This is the economic reality underneath the diplomatic language. And it is the reason that, when you read the Versailles Memorandum carefully, the language is not what you would expect from a victor. Diplomatic documents are almost always written to obscure more than they reveal. The words on the page are a carefully negotiated performance of much messier underlying reality. The real negotiation happens in the margins, in the brackets around disputed clauses, in the decision about which things go in the text versus which things are handled through side letters that never see a press conference. With that caveat in mind, what came out of the French summit is genuinely unusual if you read it against the backdrop of the previous 46 years of American policy toward the Islamic Republic. The language commits both parties to respecting what it calls mutual sovereign integrity and the right of each state to conduct its internal affairs without external interference. That phrase on its own might seem boilerplate. Every international agreement uses formulations like this, but in the specific context of a relationship in which one party had spent nearly 5 decades funding internal opposition movements, broadcasting regime change messaging into the other's territory, and explicitly treating the other government as illegitimate, that language is not boilerplate. It is a concession. The reconstruction provision is staggering in its scale. A fund of over $200 billion, contingent on compliance benchmarks, structured over a multi-year timeline, tied to monitoring mechanisms, but real in its intention. For context, the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Western Europe after the Second World War amounted to roughly $17 billion at the time, which translates to approximately $200 billion in today's purchasing power. Washington is committing, in a document with Iran's signature on it, to a reconstruction fund of equivalent magnitude. And then there is the nuclear language. For 2 decades, the central premise of Western policy on Iran's nuclear program was that enrichment had to stop. The stockpile had to be handed over, and the entire infrastructure of enrichment had to be dismantled before any other conversation could proceed. This was the sequencing. Dismantle first, negotiate second. The Versailles Memorandum inverts this. Iran reaffirms its stated position that it will not pursue a weapon, a position it has maintained publicly, whatever one thinks of its credibility. And the question of what happens to the existing enriched stockpile is described as a matter to be handled through a mutually agreed mechanism, not a precondition, a working group. Victors do not write documents like this. The language of this memorandum is the language of 2 exhausted parties who have each inflicted and absorbed more damage than they originally planned for, sitting down to write a framework that lets both sides go home without admitting what they actually agreed to. Iranian analysts writing in Persian language outlets in the days after the signing were careful to distinguish between what the document said and what it meant. What it said was a ceasefire framework with reconstruction provisions. What it meant, in their reading, was international recognition of the Islamic Republic as a legitimate sovereign actor that the United States had attempted to destroy and had failed. That framing is contested. American officials have pushed back on it publicly, with some characterizing the deal as Iran's capitulation after suffering catastrophic losses to its military infrastructure. And those losses are real. By independent assessments, Iranian air defense capability was degraded by somewhere between 50 and 70%. Several of its most advanced centrifuge facilities were struck with precision munitions. Its naval capacity in the Gulf sustained damage that will take years to fully rebuild. But here is the part of this accounting that tends to get omitted in the Western retelling. Iran's supreme leader was killed in the opening strikes. That is an almost incomprehensible blow to a system built around the authority of that position. The conventional prediction, the prediction that shaped the original planning assumptions, was that this would trigger internal collapse. Competing factions would turn on each other. The population, already strained by decades of economic pressure, would see an opportunity and take it. Instead, Iranian domestic polling conducted by third-party researchers through the conflict shows approval ratings for the government that rose during the war, not fell. The external attack, as has happened in virtually every comparable historical case from Serbia in 1999 to North Korea in the 1950s, produced a rally around the flag effect that the planners had either not modeled or not believed. The result is a document that looks like a peace treaty but functions as a proof of concept. The concept being that a state with genuine strategic leverage, even one that has absorbed devastating military punishment, can still extract a framework that treats it as a sovereign equal rather than a defeated client. Countries watching this outcome from their own corners of the world will draw their own conclusions about what it means. And that is where the story stops being about Iran. 4 soldiers died near a ridge that looks out over one of the largest towns in southern Lebanon. 4 deaths in a war that has produced thousands. By any arithmetic of military loss, this was not a numerically exceptional day. But the emotional and political response inside Israel was not proportional to the number. It was proportional to the timing, and the timing was everything. Israelis had spent the previous 72 hours processing the Versailles Framework, a document that their government had not been part of negotiating, had not endorsed, and had been publicly pressured to accommodate. The sense across Israeli political commentary, expressed with unusual unanimity across the left-right divide that normally fractures Israeli public discourse, was that something had shifted structurally in the relationship with Washington in a way that went beyond a single disagreement over tactics. The deaths on the Ridge arrived into that atmosphere, and the combination produced something closer to a political earthquake than a military incident. To understand what cracked, you have to understand what the relationship had looked like before. Since 1979, and especially since the 1990s, the operating model of Israeli security strategy had rested on a specific assumption about American power. The assumption was not merely that Washington would provide weapons, intelligence support, and diplomatic cover at the United Nations. Those things are concrete and measurable and well documented. The deeper assumption was categorical. It was that American and Israeli threat assessments, while not identical, were close enough to functionally identical that Washington's default position would always be to provide whatever Israel determined it needed to address whatever Israel determined was a threat. The phrase that got used again and again in Israeli security documents and think tank publications was shared strategic vision. The idea that two democracies with overlapping enemies and overlapping values would naturally converge on overlapping responses. That model worked more or less for 4 decades. It worked through the Gulf War, when Israel absorbed Iraqi Scud strikes without retaliating at Washington's request. It worked through multiple rounds of fighting in Gaza and Lebanon, during which American diplomatic intervention arrived reliably enough to provide both protection and exit ramps. It worked through the Obama years, which saw genuine friction on settlements and Iran policy, but no rupture in the underlying security relationship. The Versailles Memorandum did not just crack that model. It cracked it in public, in a way that left no ambiguity about the geometry of the break. American officials at the post-summit press conference used language about Israeli military operations in Beirut that no senior American official had used publicly in living memory. One characterization, that the level of force being applied was producing outcomes that, quote, should embarrass anyone with a conscience, was picked up by every major Israeli outlet within the hour, and treated not as a diplomatic reproach, but as something closer to a declaration. Inside the Israeli political system, the domestic incentives created by this moment are almost perfectly designed to prevent the one outcome Washington is pushing for, which is de-escalation. The Prime Minister is facing a corruption trial whose verdict timeline has become intertwined with his political survival in ways that are genuinely difficult to separate. His polling, which had shown a comfortable lead as recently as late 2024, has collapsed to something approaching a coin flip. And the loudest voices inside his governing coalition, the ministers whose votes he cannot afford to lose, have been saying explicitly and publicly that any restraint in Lebanon will be characterized as surrender to American pressure, and that surrender to American pressure will cost votes in the next election. This is the trap. Washington is telling Israel to stand down. Israel's own domestic political gravity is telling the Prime Minister that standing down means losing power. And losing power, in the current legal context, means losing the political protection that comes with the office itself. The ceasefires that get announced in this environment are not ceasefires in any durable sense. They are pauses. They last days, sometimes hours. A provocation resets the clock. A retaliatory strike resets it again. And the Americans, who are trying to hold the thing together with phone calls and emissaries, are discovering that phone calls are not load-bearing infrastructure when the underlying political incentives run in the opposite direction. What makes this moment different from earlier rounds of the same cycle is the audience. There is now a visible and vocal segment of the American political commentariat that has started saying things publicly that were genuinely unsayable as recently as 2 years ago. The argument, which is gaining traction in media outlets that helped build the consensus it is now critiquing, goes something like this. American foreign policy in the region has been systematically subordinated to Israeli decision-making in a way that serves Israeli objectives rather than American ones. That an ally, by definition, should advance the interests of the partnership. And that when an ally's actions consistently drain American strategic reserves and American political capital in pursuit of objectives Washington does not share and did not authorize, the relationship has drifted from alliance into something closer to clientelism, with Washington as the client. This argument does not need to be entirely fair to be politically powerful. It only needs to land with enough of a restive domestic audience that the electoral math starts to shift. We are roughly halfway through this story. And if you have been tracking the argument, you have noticed that we have covered an enormous amount of ground. Iran, Lebanon, American domestic politics, Israeli coalition arithmetic, without yet answering the question in the title. Why is Moscow burning? The answer to that question turns out to require everything we have just covered. Because the drone swarms over the Russian capital are not a separate story. They are a response to the same underlying dynamic that produced the Versailles Memorandum and the ceasefire collapses in southern Lebanon. They are what European capitals do when they look at the Persian Gulf deal and conclude that American attention is drifting, and decide to stage something dramatic enough to pull it back. Stay with it. The numbers matter here, so let us be precise about them. In the single largest drone operation of the Ukraine war to that point, Ukrainian forces launched what multiple independent tracking systems estimated at between 500 and 540 drones across a multi-front corridor spanning roughly 800 kilometers. Of those, somewhere between 180 and 200 were directed specifically at targets within Moscow's administrative boundaries. Approximately 200 were intercepted by Russian air defense systems on approach, but not all of them. A significant number reached their targets. The Kapotnya oil refinery, one of the largest in the Moscow region, processing approximately 12 million tons of crude per year, was struck for the second time in 72 hours. The resulting fires produced a plume of black smoke visible from space and a layer of oily particulate that settled on residential neighborhoods across the southern and southeastern districts of the capital. 4 airports serving Moscow were temporarily closed to inbound traffic. Several metro lines rerouted around stations near the strike zones. Local social media filled with videos that bypassed official censorship, fast enough that suppression became pointless. Millions of ordinary Muscovites sharing footage of the skyline on fire above their own city. This was not a pinprick. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was a capability statement, and a deliberate one. You do not conduct your largest single operation of a multi-year war by accident. You conduct it when you need the footage. And the question that almost never gets asked clearly enough in Western coverage of these events is, who needed it, and why, and at exactly this moment? The strikes began less than 48 hours before NATO defense ministers were scheduled to convene in Brussels for a session that was explicitly framed around the question of long-term support frameworks for Ukraine. The same week saw a parallel European Council summit in which the centerpiece agenda item was a joint statement on the future of the continent's defense architecture. This is not a coincidence. Military planners do not coordinate their largest operations to arrive at random points on the calendar. They time them. And the timing of the Moscow strikes relative to the Brussels summits is the most important piece of information in this entire sequence. More important than the targets, more important than the casualty figures, more important than the impressive technical achievement of penetrating Moscow's air defense perimeter. The message being sent was not directed at Russia. Russia already knew Ukraine could build drones and project them at range. That had been established over months of smaller but significant strikes. The message was directed at the European leaders sitting in the conference rooms in Brussels, and through them, at the American president, who was visibly more focused on his Gulf diplomacy than on the Eastern European theater. The message was, the momentum has shifted. This war is winnable, and this is the moment to lean in, not to let fatigue set in. European officials making the case for renewed escalation tend to present a relatively clean picture of the economic balance. Russia's oil revenues remain under pressure. Individual sectors have contracted. Inflation has run hotter than the Kremlin would prefer to admit publicly. Some regions have experienced fuel rationing. All of that is true. But it is not the whole picture. Russian GDP, according to estimates from institutions, including the International Monetary Fund and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, contracted by approximately 2 to 3% in the immediate aftermath of the 2022 invasion and the subsequent sanctions package, and then recovered. By 2024, Russian economic output was running at levels that most pre-war forecasters would have described as impossible under the sanctions burden those forecasters expected. Employment has held up. Defense production has scaled dramatically, with the Russian military-industrial complex running multiple shifts and expanding capacity in ways that several European defense ministries have found frankly alarming. And critically, Russia has diversified its trade relationships enough that the dollar-denominated sanctions architecture that worked reasonably well against smaller economies is now leaking at multiple points simultaneously. None of this means the strikes are ineffective. Hitting the Kapotnya refinery carries a real economic cost, both in the direct damage and in the insurance and operational consequences that ripple through the energy logistics system. The cumulative effect of sustained pressure on Russian energy infrastructure is not trivial. But there is a difference between pressure and decision-forcing capability. Pressure can go on for a long time without producing the outcome the pressure is intended to produce. Decision-forcing capability is different. It is the kind of pressure that crosses a threshold and forces the other party to choose between options it considers unacceptable. And by that measure, the drone campaign, however impressive its scale, has not yet demonstrated decision-forcing capability. Here's the question that European planners have not answered publicly, and that their American counterparts have been visibly uncomfortable being asked. If the drone campaign at current scale does not produce Russian capitulation or negotiation on terms Ukraine and its allies would accept, what comes next? The logic of escalation runs in a direction. If 500 drones do not change Russian calculations, the next option up the ladder involves deeper strikes, larger munitions, targets that are more economically and politically sensitive than a refinery in a Moscow suburb. And then the next step after that, and the step after that. Russian officials have responded to the Moscow attacks not by signaling willingness to negotiate, but by threatening what they describe as qualitatively escalatory responses, using capabilities they characterize as more powerful than anything yet deployed. This language is familiar from previous points in the conflict. It has been used before without triggering the escalation it described. But familiarity is not the same as irrelevance. A threat that has been made multiple times without being carried out becomes discounted. A threat that becomes sufficiently discounted eventually reaches a point where the only way to restore its credibility is to act on it. At which point, the response is no longer a threat. The confidence that this threshold will never actually be crossed, that the escalation ladder has a final run above which no rational actor will climb, is the same confident assumption that failed inside the planning rooms before the Iran strikes. The assumption that the adversary would not survive the opening blow, the assumption that the population would not rally, the assumption that Washington's support would remain unconditional. Confident assumptions that have not been stress tested against their own failure mode are not analysis. They are wishful thinking with a spreadsheet attached. Pull back far enough from all three of these theaters simultaneously, and something comes into focus that is almost impossible to see when you are tracking any single story in isolation. Every major actor in this drama, Iranian negotiators, Israeli coalition ministers, Ukrainian military planners, European heads of government, Russian security officials, is making a bet. A bet about the same underlying variable, a bet about how much longer American primacy in its current form holds together, and how much of the cost of that primacy Washington is willing to continue absorbing before its own domestic politics force a rebalancing. Iran bet that it could outlast the pressure long enough to force a negotiated outcome rather than a coerced submission. For now, with the Versailles framework initialed and its main provisions being implemented on schedule, that bet appears to have paid off, not without enormous cost, but paid off. Israel's government is betting that domestic political survival requires demonstrating strength in Lebanon regardless of what Washington prefers. That bet remains unresolved. It depends on a proposition that the American relationship can absorb the damage being done to it without reaching a point where the political cost of unconditional support becomes larger than the political cost of friction. European governments are betting that a combination of dramatic military optics, staged summit momentum, and an honest appeal to American self-interest in preventing Russian victory can pull Washington's attention and resources back toward the Eastern European theater before the support pipeline is allowed to run down. None of these bets is irrational. Each actor is responding to the incentives that sit directly in front of it. The problem is not that any single decision in this chain is crazy. The problem is that rational decisions made in isolation by actors who are not coordinating with each other and who have each answered only their own piece of the strategic question without honestly addressing what happens when their assumptions fail can still produce an outcome that none of them individually wanted, and none of them individually has a plan for managing. There is one more thing worth naming, because it is the element that tends to get lost in coverage that focuses exclusively on the military and economic dimensions. Language is doing more work in this story than most observers are giving it credit for. The rhetorical framework through which the United States and its allies have approached adversarial states for 30 years depends on a prior step. Before you can sustain the domestic and international consensus required to impose sanctions, support proxy forces, or conduct military operations against another state, you first have to establish that the state in question is not a normal sovereign actor with normal interests that a reasonable government might reasonably defend. You have to establish that it is a rogue, an outlier, a category of actor to whom the considerations you would extend to France or Brazil simply do not apply. This is what the phrase state sponsor of terrorism accomplished for 4 decades of Iran policy. It was not merely a legal designation. It was the rhetorical permission structure that made every subsequent pressure measure feel like a proportionate response to an inherently illegitimate adversary, rather than like coercion of a sovereign state for geopolitical advantage. What is striking about the language coming out of the administration in the wake of the Versailles framework is how casually it has abandoned this permission structure. There have been on-the-record statements suggesting that Iran, like Saudi Arabia, has a right to conventional deterrent capability appropriate to its regional security environment, that a state surrounded by adversarial military infrastructure has the same sovereign prerogative to defend itself that any other state would enjoy. That is not a small shift in register. It is the beginning of a reframe that, if it solidifies into policy rather than remaining a rhetorical trial balloon, would restructure the entire justificatory architecture through which the last 46 years of Iran policy was sold to American and allied publics. Rhetorical frames are not decoration. They are the structures that make some future policy choices feel natural and make others feel unthinkable. And a frame that normalizes Iran as a sovereign actor, rather than an inherently illegitimate outlier, opens certain diplomatic doors while closing others, permanently, or at least for a very long time. Step back from the immediate actors and consider who else is watching this sequence of events with close attention. In Beijing, strategic planners who have spent 15 years studying how the United States applies economic coercion are watching an adversary that was subjected to 46 years of maximum pressure economics successfully extract a framework that treats it as a sovereign equal. The question being asked in those planning sessions is not theoretical, it is operational. What combination of leverage and endurance would be required to replicate that outcome in our own context? In Pyongyang, where the government has built its entire survival strategy around the proposition that a nuclear deterrent makes regime change too costly for the United States to pursue, the Versailles outcome provides a data point. A state that held out long enough extracted concessions. A state that capitulates, as Libya's Muammar Gaddafi demonstrated in 2003 when he surrendered his weapons program and was rewarded with rehabilitation before eventually being killed with tacit Western support, extracts nothing except a temporary reprieve. In capitals across the global south, in countries that have been subjected to dollar sanctions, exclusion from SWIFT, tariff regimes, and investment restrictions, the lesson being drawn is also not subtle. Leverage, backed by genuine willingness to absorb the cost of using it, can still force a negotiated outcome rather than a coerced submission. This is a dangerous lesson for the current international order to be teaching, precisely because the current international order has depended, since roughly 1991, on the opposite lesson being believed. It has depended on the proposition that defying American-led pressure leads to escalating costs with no exit except submission. The Versailles Memorandum puts that proposition in serious question. And questions, once seriously posed, have a way of spreading faster than the systems they question can manage. History has a specific way of punishing confident assumptions. It does not punish them immediately. It lets them run long enough to become load-bearing, long enough that institutions, strategies, alliances, and political careers are built on top of them. And then, at a moment that is almost always badly timed from the perspective of everyone involved, it stress tests them. The confident assumption that Iran would collapse under the pressure of a decapitation strike was stress tested in 2024 and 2025. It did not hold. The confident assumption that Israel could pursue its objectives in Lebanon without the political costs landing on Washington was stress tested at the Versailles summit. The language of the press conference afterward suggests it did not hold either. The confident assumption that Russia's resolve would crack before European public patience did is currently being stress tested in real time over a Moscow skyline illuminated by refinery fires that are as much a political statement as a military one. What ties all three of these stress tests together is the entity at the center of each of them, the United States. More specifically, the question of what American power actually costs, what it can realistically absorb, and how much further it can be stretched before something snaps. The Iranian framework, the Lebanese flare-up, and the drone campaign over Moscow are all, at their core, bets about the answer to that question. Iran bet that the cost was already higher than Washington could sustain. Israel's government is betting that the relationship has enough inertia to survive the current friction. Europe is betting that the right combination of optics and genuine shared interest can pull Washington back before fatigue sets in. Each of these bets might be right. Each of them might be wrong. What none of the actors making them has done, at least not in any public forum, is honestly answer the question of what they do if they are wrong. What Iran does if the Versailles framework collapses under the weight of Israeli pressure and American domestic politics. What Israel's government does if the political costs of unconditional American support become high enough that even this administration eventually places conditions on it. What Europe does if Ukraine's momentum stalls, Russian resolve holds, and the American president decides the midterm arithmetic requires him to wind down rather than escalate. The margin for error in each of these scenarios is shrinking. Not because any single actor is making obviously irrational decisions, but because multiple actors making locally rational decisions in response to their own immediate incentives, without coordinating on the shared question of what the endgame actually looks like, can produce outcomes that none of them wanted and none of them was prepared for. That is not a prediction. History is not that accommodating of predictions. It is an observation. The smoke over Moscow is real. The cracks in the American-Israeli relationship are real. The language of the Versailles Memorandum is real. And margins that shrink without anyone deciding to shrink them have never, in the long record of international history, simply expanded again on their own. Something has to force them. The question is what? And the question of what is the most dangerous open question in international politics right now, there is one actor we have not talked about, an actor who watched the Versailles process from close range, an actor who has been buying American weapon systems and American security guarantees for 50 years, an actor who controls approximately 12% of the world's proven oil reserves and who has been having quiet conversations with both Beijing and Tehran for the past 18 months that Washington only partially understands. Riyadh has been watching all of this very carefully. And what Riyadh decides to do next, whether to deepen its dollar dependence or accelerate its hedging, whether to treat the American umbrella as durable or as something that needs a backup, may turn out to be the decision that determines whether the world we are describing right now stabilizes into a new equilibrium or tips into something considerably less predictable. The Saudi calculation. What the kingdom knows, what it is deciding, and why it might be the most consequential foreign policy question of the next decade. That is next.